Jake Holloway killed the engines of his repair shuttle and let out a long yawn. 3 in the morning was nobody's favorite time to get a service call, but emergency rates paid double, and his rent wasn't going to pay itself. He grabbed his coffee thermos from the cup holder and took a long sip of the now cold liquid. It tasted terrible, but it would have to do. Docking Bay 7 sat on the edge of human-controlled space, one of those quiet stations where not much happened except fuel stops and the occasional cargo transfer. Jake had been working this sector for 5 years now, fixing busted engines and patched up life support systems for traders and haulers who couldn't afford the fancy corporate repair bays closer to Earth. But when he looked through his cockpit window, he nearly dropped his thermos. The ship waiting for him was absolutely massive. It had to be 3 times the size of any civilian transport he'd ever worked on, maybe bigger. The hull wasn't like the boxy, practical designs humans used. This thing was sleek and curved, almost organic looking, with a dark metal that seemed to drink in the light from the docking bay. Strange symbols ran along the sides in a language he couldn't read, glowing faintly with a soft blue light. Jake recognized the design immediately. Valorian. One of those advanced alien civilizations that had been traveling the stars while humans were still figuring out agriculture. They had money, lots of it, and they usually hired their own kind for repairs. Humans were considered too primitive, too unsophisticated to touch their precious technology. So what was a Valorian ship doing calling for a budget human mechanic at 3 in the morning? He sealed up his shuttle, grabbed his toolkit from the back and headed down the loading ramp. The docking bay was cold and empty, just flickering overhead lights and the hum of ventilation systems. His boots echoed on the metal floor as he approached the massive vessel. That's when he saw her. The alien woman stood beside the boarding ramp of her ship, and Jake had to tilt his head back to look at her properly. She towered over him at maybe 9 feet tall, with deep purple skin that caught the light in an almost metallic shimmer. She had 4 arms, and all of them were crossed tightly over her chest in a way that looked anxious. Her face was humanoid enough that he could read expressions, and right now she looked exhausted and terrified. Her large, dark eyes kept darting between him and her ship, like she was expecting something terrible to happen any second. Jake had dealt with plenty of alien species in his years as a mechanic, but Valorians were rare. Most of them wouldn't even make eye contact with humans, let alone hire them. "You're the mechanic?" Her voice came through his translator earpiece, synthesized but carrying the emotional weight behind the words. She sounded like someone who hadn't slept in days and was running on pure desperation. Jake adjusted his worn baseball cap and gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Yes, ma'am. Jake Holloway, Stellar Fix-It Solutions. I got your emergency call about an hour ago." He shifted his heavy toolkit to his other hand. "What's the problem we're dealing with here?" The alien woman's 4 hands tightened, and for a moment Jake thought she might break down crying. "Everything," she said, her voice cracking slightly through the translation. "The main drive is failing. Life support keeps fluctuating. The navigation system is barely holding together." She paused and Jake saw her hands trembling. "And I have 3 children aboard who need to reach medical facilities in the core systems within 48 hours. My youngest, she has a condition that requires specialized treatment. If we don't reach the hospital in time." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Jake glanced past her toward the viewport of the ship. Through the transparent sections he could see 3 smaller figures huddled together inside. Kids. Even through the layers of technology and alien biology, he recognized the universal look of scared children. They were pressed against each other, their large eyes watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. The smallest one, barely visible behind her siblings, looked pale even for a Valorian. Something tightened in Jake's chest. He thought about his own younger sister back on Earth, how protective he'd always been of her growing up. He couldn't imagine being stranded in space with her life on the line. He set his toolkit down with a solid thunk and rolled up his sleeves. The fabric of his work jacket was stained with grease and scarred with burn marks from 100 different repair jobs. His hands were calloused and rough, nothing like the sophisticated technicians the Valorians probably used. But right now he was all this mother had. "Well then," Jake said, meeting her eyes with determination. "We better get to work. Show me inside and let's see what we're dealing with." "And ma'am?" He picked up his toolkit again. "I don't care what species you are or what fancy technology your ship runs on. A mom trying to save her kid is something I understand just fine. We're going to get your family to that hospital. I promise you that." Jake stepped through the airlock and immediately knew this was going to be worse than he thought. The ship's interior was beautiful, all smooth curves and soft lighting, the kind of luxury design that probably cost more than he'd make in 10 years. But right now that beautiful ship was dying. The main corridor flickered with emergency lighting, casting everything in an eerie red glow. He could hear systems whining and groaning, struggling to keep functioning. The air had that particular metallic taste that meant the recyclers were working overtime. Somewhere deep in the walls, something was making a grinding noise that made his teeth hurt. Valera led him to the engine room, her 4 arms gesturing frantically at different panels. Her 3 children followed at a distance, the older 2 holding the youngest between them. The sick one. Jake gave them a small wave and what he hoped was a confident smile. Kids needed to see adults who looked like they knew what they were doing, even when those adults were terrified. The engine room made him whistle low under his breath. The primary power coupling, the heart of the whole ship, had a crack running through it like a lightning bolt. It must have hit debris, something big enough to fracture the exotic metal the Valorians used. And when that coupling went, it took half the ship's systems down with it. Power conduits had melted and fused together in ways that would make any engineer cry. The backup systems were overloaded, trying to compensate for the damage and slowly burning themselves out in the process. The diagnostic panel on the wall looked like a Christmas tree, except instead of pretty lights it was just screaming red warnings at him. Critical failure here, system collapse there, imminent shutdown everywhere. Jake set down his toolkit and pulled out his scanner, a battered old thing held together with electrical tape and hope. He ran it over the coupling, watching the readings scroll past on the small screen. Valera hovered behind him, literally wringing all 4 of her hands together in anxiety. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake did some quick mental math, factoring in the extent of the damage, the parts he'd need, the time to properly rebuild everything to Valorian standards. To do this properly? 3 days, maybe 4. Need to order specialty parts, do a complete system rebuild, test everything twice. He turned to look at her, saw the despair starting to fill those large alien eyes. But to get you flying and get that little one to the doctors? He grinned, the kind of grin his sister always said made him look either crazy or confident. "Give me 8 hours. Valera's eyes went even wider. 8 hours? But the systems require Valorian-grade components. The coupling alone needs molecular bonding that takes. Valorian parts and Valorian protocols, yeah. Jake was already pulling components from his toolkit, stuff that probably looked like junk to her sophisticated eyes. Rolls of high-tensile wire, industrial adhesive patches, circuit bypasses, and his favorite tool, a plasma welder he'd modified himself. But I'm human. We specialize in making things work with what we've got. He got to work, and Valera watched in fascination and growing amazement. First, Jake tackled the cracked coupling. He couldn't fix it properly, that would take materials he didn't have. But he could reinforce it. He pulled spare hull plating from a storage panel, cut it into precise strips with his welder, and began creating a support structure around the fracture. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. The metal strips formed a cage around the damaged coupling, distributing the stress across multiple points instead of letting it concentrate on the crack. "That won't work," the ship's computer announced in a pleasant voice. "Hull plating cannot sustain power flow temperatures." "Watch me," Jake muttered, adding a cooling loop he jury-rigged from the beverage cooler system. Cold liquid started circulating around his makeshift repair, keeping everything from melting. Next came the power distribution problem. Half the conduits were fried and he didn't have replacements. So Jake did what humans do best. He improvised. He traced the ship's wiring and found that the entertainment system, the one running all those fancy view screens and music players, was on a completely separate power grid. Luxury ships always had redundant systems for passenger comfort. He rerouted life support through the entertainment circuits. Suddenly, every view screen in the ship was displaying oxygen levels and temperature readouts, but more importantly, the environmental system stabilized. Valera watched him work, her 4 hands gradually unclenching. "How did you know to do that?" "Same principle as any electrical system," Jake said, now upside down in an access panel with his legs sticking out. His voice echoed from inside the walls. "Power is power. Doesn't matter if it's meant for playing music or pumping air. Just gotta make sure the voltage is right and the connections are solid." The ship's computer kept protesting. "Warning, bypassing primary navigation computer will result in system failure." Jake bypassed it anyway, jumping the navigation through the backup auxiliary system meant for emergency docking. "You don't need fancy navigation to follow a straight line to the core systems," he called out to Valera. "This'll get you there." By hour 4, Jake had bypassed or repaired a dozen critical systems. He was covered in grease, his hands had 3 new burns, and he was pretty sure he'd pulled something in his back. But the ship was coming back to life. The red emergency lighting faded, replaced by normal illumination. The grinding noise stopped. The air started tasting clean again. Valera's youngest daughter had crept closer, watching him work with fascination. She looked less pale now that the environmental systems were properly oxygenating the ship. "How did you learn this?" Valera asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Jake emerged from yet another access panel, wiping his hands on his already filthy jacket. He smiled, thinking of his dad's old garage back on Earth, the weekend afternoon spent fixing ancient cars that should have been in museums. "Growing up, my dad fixed cars with duct tape and prayer. We couldn't afford new parts, couldn't afford fancy mechanics. So we learned to make do with what we had." He looked at his improvised repairs, the patchwork of human ingenuity holding together alien technology. Turns out that skill works pretty well in space too. By hour 6, Jake ran a final diagnostic check on the main systems. The scanner showed green lights across the board. Well, mostly green. A few yellows here and there, but nothing critical. The ship could fly. It would make the journey to the core systems without exploding or suffocating everyone aboard. That was the job done. He should pack up his tools, collect his payment, and head back to his shuttle. He had other service calls waiting, and his bed back at the station was calling his name. He'd been awake for almost 20 hours straight. But Jake didn't pack up. Instead, he grabbed his scanner and headed toward the environmental control systems at the back of the ship. Valera found him there 10 minutes later, elbow deep in the climate control panel. Her 4 hands were on her hips now, confusion replacing the earlier anxiety. "What are you doing?" she asked. "The ship is functional. Your diagnostics showed we could fly." Jake didn't look up from the tangle of wires and circuits he was sorting through. "Functional isn't the same as safe," he said, his voice slightly muffled as he leaned deeper into the panel. "You've got a week-long journey ahead of you with 3 kids. I'm making sure your climate control doesn't fail mid-jump. But the emergency repairs are complete." "You said." "I said you could fly, yeah." Jake pulled back and wiped his forehead with his sleeve, leaving a new smear of grease across his face. "But I've been checking your environmental systems while working on the other stuff. Your air recyclers are running at 60% efficiency. That's fine for a day or two, but over a week? With 3 kids breathing the air? You'd start getting headaches, fatigue, maybe worse." He turned back to the panel and started recalibrating the recycler's intake valves. "And your water filtration system has a slow leak in the secondary tank. Not enough to be dangerous right now, but 3 days into your trip? You'd be rationing water while your sick daughter needs to stay hydrated." Valera watched him work, something shifting in her chest. A strange, unfamiliar feeling. "Your company," she said slowly, "they are paying you for emergency repairs only. The contract was for propulsion and life support restoration." Jake's hands paused for just a moment, then continued working. "Yeah, I know what the contract says." "Then why are you still here?" "Because you're paying for peace of mind." Jake finally pulled himself out of the access panel and turned to face her. He glanced past Valera to where her 3 children were playing in the corridor. They'd relaxed over the past few hours, their earlier fear replaced with curiosity. The 2 older ones were showing the youngest some kind of holographic game, and she was actually laughing. "You're a mom doing everything you can for your kids. The least I can do is make sure you get there safely." The youngest girl, the sick one, had been watching Jake work for the past hour. She seemed fascinated by his tools and the way he fixed things. Every time he emerged from a panel or finished a repair, she'd give him a little wave. Jake always waved back. Valera's 4 arms dropped to her sides. In her world, in Valorian society, service providers did exactly what the contract specified. Not one bit more, not one bit less. Efficiency was valued. Time was money. Extra work meant extra charges always. The idea of someone doing more than required for no additional payment was alien to her. More alien than Jake himself. "Why would you do more than required?" she asked, genuinely trying to understand. Jake paused, setting down his tools. He looked at Valera's children again, then back at her. "Because it's the right thing to do." He shrugged, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. "And because if it were my mom and my siblings out here, stranded in space with one of them sick, I'd hope someone would do the same. I'd hope they'd go the extra mile to make sure my family got home safe." He picked up his scanner again and moved to the communications array. "Besides, I've seen what happens when systems fail mid-jump. Space is dangerous enough without wondering if your distress beacon will work when you need it." For the next 2 hours, Jake worked his way through every non-critical system on the ship. He recalibrated the climate control to run at optimal efficiency. He patched the water filtration leak and cleaned the filters while he was at it. He checked the food storage units and fixed a temperature inconsistency that would have spoiled half their provisions by day 4. He even repaired a minor glitch in the children's entertainment system, just because he noticed it flickering. The oldest child, a boy, started helping him. Well, helping might be generous. Mostly he handed Jake tools and asked a million questions about how everything worked. Jake answered every single one patiently, explaining human engineering principles in simple terms the kid could understand. On Earth we have a saying, Jake told him while adjusting the backup power cells. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Means it's easier to stop problems before they start than to fix them after they break. Humans have many sayings, the boy observed. Jake laughed. Yeah, we do. My dad had one for every situation. Used to drive me crazy when I was your age. He tightened a final connection and nodded with satisfaction. There we go. Your backup power will last 3 times longer now. Valera stood in the doorway, watching this strange human mechanic teach her son about engineering while making sure her family would survive the journey ahead. She'd hired the cheapest emergency service available, expecting the bare minimum. Instead, she'd found something she didn't know still existed in the galaxy. She'd found someone who genuinely cared. Jake was on his hands and knees, securing the last panel on the environmental control system, when he felt a small tug on his pant leg. He looked down to find Valera's youngest daughter standing there, the sick one he'd been so worried about. She looked so much better now than when he'd first arrived. Her skin had regained its color, and her eyes were bright and alert instead of dim with exhaustion. Through his translator earpiece, her tiny voice came through. Thank you for helping us. Jake's chest tightened. He'd been working on machines for so long that he sometimes forgot why he really did this job. It wasn't about the circuits and the wiring. It was about the people depending on those systems to survive. He set down his wrench and knelt down to her level, putting himself at eye height with the little girl. You're very welcome, sweetheart, he said gently. You feel better now that the air's working right? Not so tired anymore? She nodded enthusiastically, her large eyes sparkling. Then she did something that surprised him. She reached out with both her small hands and hugged him, wrapping her arms around his neck. Jake froze for a second, then carefully hugged her back, mindful of how delicate she seemed. You made the scary noises stop, she whispered. And now Mama isn't scared anymore. Jake glanced up at Valera, who was standing in the doorway watching the exchange. He saw moisture gathering in her large eyes, the alien equivalent of tears. Well, that's good, Jake said to the little girl. Because brave girls like you deserve to have ships that don't make scary noises. And your mama deserves to not worry so much. The girl pulled back and smiled at him, then ran off to join her siblings who were playing some kind of game in the corridor. Jake stood up slowly, his knees protesting after 12 hours of crawling around the ship. He rolled his shoulders, feeling every ache and pain, and started gathering his tools. Valera watched him work in silence for a moment. Jake could feel her staring like she was trying to figure something out. He'd learned to read alien body language over the years, and right now Valera looked like someone wrestling with a difficult decision. He was securing the last of his tools in his toolkit when she finally spoke. Jake Holloway, she said, her voice taking on a formal tone he hadn't heard before. I must confess something to you. Jake looked up from his toolkit, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. Ma'am? Valera's 4 hands clasped together in front of her, a gesture that seemed nervous and important at the same time. I have not been entirely truthful about who I am. She took a breath. I am Valera Thonsari. I own Thonsari Galactic Enterprises. Jake blinked, the name trying to connect with something in his memory. Thonsari. Why did that sound familiar? Valera continued, Stellar Fix-It Solutions, the company that employs you. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Your company is one of my subsidiaries. You work for me, Jake. I own the company that pays your salary. Jake's jaw dropped. The wrench he'd been holding clattered to the floor. You're the Valera Thonsari? The transport magnate? The one who owns half the shipping lanes in this sector. He'd seen her name on business news feeds, heard other mechanics talk about the company with a mixture of respect and fear. Thonsari Galactic Enterprises was massive, one of the biggest logistics and transport corporations in known space. They had contracts with dozens of governments, moved trillions in goods every year, and employed millions across hundreds of worlds. And he'd just spent 12 hours treating the owner like any other stranded traveler. Oh man, Jake said, running a hand through his hair. I called you ma'am. I shared my sandwich with your kids. I complained about the circuit design in your ship's power systems. Valera made a sound that might have been a laugh. Yes, you did all those things. Why didn't you say something? Jake asked. Why call for a budget emergency service? You could have had a whole fleet of specialized technicians here in hours. I travel in modest vessels with false identification when I'm with my children, Valera explained. For security reasons. There are those who would harm them to get to me, to my company. She gestured at the ship around them. This is a standard civilian transport. Nothing fancy, nothing that draws attention. And I called the most affordable emergency service because I thought it would suffice. I thought any basic mechanic could patch the systems enough to get us moving. Her voice softened, and she looked at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. I was profoundly wrong. It wasn't just sufficient. It was extraordinary. Jake processed this information, then did the only thing that made sense. He laughed. Not a mocking laugh, but genuine amusement at the absurdity of the situation. Well, ma'am, he said, shaking his head, I really hope you didn't get more than you bargained for. I know I probably did things weird compared to your usual technicians. Valera stepped closer, her 4 hands spreading in a gesture that seemed emphatic. I got exactly what the galaxy needs more of, she said quietly. I got honesty, integrity, compassion. I got someone who treated my family like they mattered, not because of who I am or what I own, but simply because we needed help. She looked toward her children, who were now laughing together, healthy and happy and safe. You worked for 12 hours straight. You refused my offers of extra payment. You shared your food with my children and made them laugh with stories about Earth. You taught my son about engineering and made my daughter feel safe. Her voice wavered slightly. And you did all of this without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return beyond your basic contract payment. Jake shifted uncomfortably, not used to this kind of praise. I just did what anyone would do. No, Valera said firmly. You did what a good human would do. And that, Jake Holloway, is something far more rare and valuable than you realize. 2 months later, Jake found himself standing in the most intimidating room he'd ever seen. The conference room at Thonsari headquarters was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling metropolis of the core systems. The table alone probably cost more than his entire year's salary. Everything gleamed with that effortless wealth that made him acutely aware of the grease stain on his nicest pair of pants. Around the table sat executives from a dozen different species. There were tall, crystalline beings from the outer rim. Short, stocky representatives from the mining worlds. Elegant, bird-like creatures from the diplomatic sectors. All of them were staring at him like he was some kind of exotic specimen. Jake tugged at his collar, wishing he'd bought a new shirt for this. The summons had come 3 days ago, official and formal, requesting his presence at headquarters for a matter of corporate importance. He'd assumed he was in trouble. Maybe he'd violated some protocol by working on Valera's ship without proper authorization. Maybe they were going to fine him or fire him or worse. Instead, here he was, standing in front of the most powerful executives in the sector while Valera stood at the head of the table. Her 3 children were in a viewing gallery above, their faces pressed against the glass. When they spotted him, they started waving frantically. Jake gave them a small wave back, which earned him some confused looks from the executives. Valera called the meeting to order with a gesture of her 4 hands. Thank you all for coming, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding entire corporate empires. I have called you here to discuss an incident that occurred 2 months ago, and the implications it has for our company moving forward. She activated a holographic display that showed Jake's work on her ship, pulled from the vessel's internal cameras. The executives watched in silence as the footage played, showing him crawling through access panels, jury-rigging repairs, explaining things to her children. This human, Valera announced, gesturing to Jake, worked 12 hours for 3 hours' pay. He was contracted for emergency propulsion repairs. Instead, he repaired propulsion, life support, environmental controls, communications, and water filtration. He prioritized safety over speed, compassion over profit, and excellence over adequacy. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each executive. He represents something humanity offers that we have lost. Integrity without oversight. Kindness without incentive. Quality without supervision. One of the executives, a tall being with silver skin, spoke up. With respect, Administrator Thonsari, one human mechanic working beyond contract specifications is hardly grounds for a full executive meeting. Valera's expression hardened. Isn't it? When was the last time any of our contractors did more than the absolute minimum required? When did any of our service providers care about the outcome beyond collecting payment? She gestured at the frozen image of Jake teaching her son about engineering. This human treated my family like they mattered. Not because I'm wealthy. Not because I own this company. He didn't even know who I was. He did it because it was the right thing to do. The room fell silent. Jake wanted to sink through the floor. Valera turned to face him directly. Jake Holloway, I am creating a new division within Thonsari Galactic Enterprises. Human Integration and Training. You will lead it. Your mission is to teach our mechanics across the galaxy what you showed me. That service is not merely transactional. It is personal. It is about the people depending on us. Jake's mind went blank. Ma'am, I'm just a mechanic from Nevada. I fix things. I don't know how to run a division or teach people or any of this corporate stuff. No, Valera interrupted, her voice firm but kind. You are proof that humanity belongs among the stars. Not for your weapons, though they are formidable. Not for your technology, though it improves daily. But for your hearts. For your unwillingness to accept good enough when you can do better. For your instinct to help others, even when there's no benefit to yourselves. Her children were practically bouncing in the viewing gallery above, making encouraging gestures at him. Will you accept? Valera asked. Jake looked at all those alien faces staring at him. He thought about his dad's old garage back on Earth, about the values he'd been taught. Work hard. Do it right. Help people when you can. Simple stuff that apparently wasn't so simple anymore out here in the wider galaxy. He thought about all the other mechanics he knew back on Earth and in the colonies. Good people like himself. People who'd worked double shifts to help stranded ships. People who'd shared their last rations with strangers. People who'd do exactly what he did without expecting medals or promotions. Those people deserved a chance to show the galaxy what humanity was really about. I'll do it, Jake said, his voice growing stronger. But I've got one condition. I'm hiring more humans. There's thousands of us out there who do the same thing I did. Tens of thousands probably. Good people who just need an opportunity. He looked Valera in the eye. Let's show them what we're made of. Valera's expression brightened, and if Jake didn't know better, he'd say she looked relieved. I was hoping you would say that. She extended all four of her hands toward him, and Jake reached out with his single human hand. They shook on it, her four hands engulfing his one, sealing a deal that would change how humans were seen across the galaxy. As the executives began discussing logistics and implementation, Jake glanced up at the viewing gallery. Valera's children were cheering silently behind the glass, celebrating in their own way. Jake smiled. This was how humanity would make its mark among the stars. Not through conquest or domination. Not by being the strongest or the most advanced. But through compassion, integrity, and the simple act of caring about others. And it all started because one mechanic decided to go the extra mile for a stranded mother and her kids. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.